Magnificent Delusions by Husain Haqqani, continued. American journalists had reported on the East-West chasm in Pakistan, but US policy had completely ignored it. Pakistan is an improbable country, the New York Times had pointed out on the eve of the elections. Its two parts, the Bengali East and the Punjabi West, are separated by culture, language, diet, temperament, and 1,000 miles of the unfriendly territory of India. The paper's reporter could see that the glue of Islam was losing its hold, and that Pakistan was the rare country where the majority region is the backward one. He quoted Mujib as saying, "If we are the majority, we are Pakistan." The December 1970 election had brought Pakistan's fissures to the fore. In response, West Pakistanis reacted with shades of ethnic superiority. Soon after the elections, a general visiting Dhaka told his military colleagues, "Don't worry, we will not allow these black bastards to rule over us," a reference to the darker skin colour of Bengalis compared to Pashtuns and Punjabis. "The Punjab is finished, smashed," an industrialist told the Times. "Our country has gone to the dogs," he said, "because we will be ruled by Sindh and Bengal," a reference to the fact that Mujib was Bengali, whereas Bhutto was an ethnic Sindhi. When Yahya announced that he would defer convening the legislature indefinitely, the Awami League responded by calling for civil disobedience. In response, for the next several days, the military virtually lost control of East Pakistan to Awami League mobs. West Pakistani civilians were attacked, as were central government buildings. Bangladesh flags replaced the Pakistani standard in the province. Government employees, including High Court judges, absented themselves from their offices. Mujib's residence became the new Secretariat of Bangladesh, from where he issued directives to keep the Bangladesh economy moving. Millions of Bengalis joined rallies all over East Pakistan, singing the song "Our Golden Bengal." Bangladesh had effectively seceded. After a few days of armed preparation, during which three-way talks involving the Awami League, the PPP and the army were arranged as subterfuge, Yahya ordered the army to crack down on the Bengalis. According to one Pakistani general, Yahya was assured that short and harsh action would cow down Mujib and his supporters. In the view of Pakistani generals, killing of a few thousand would not be a high price for keeping the country together. They saw Mujib as a traitor to Pakistan and were not prepared to negotiate with him further. However, two important West Pakistani military officers did not support the decision to use force. The military governor of East Pakistan, Admiral Syed Muhammad Ahsan, and the military commander of East Pakistan, Lieutenant General Sahibzada Yaqub Khan, both argued that military measures would not change the political situation. Ahsan had been Yahya's representative at Eisenhower's funeral a couple of years earlier, and Yaqub later became Pakistan's ambassador to the United States and foreign minister. US officials knew Ahsan and Yaqub well, so Washington should have heard their views. But the United States chose to stand by Yahya. A new military commander, Lieutenant General Tika Khan, arrived in Dhaka in March 1971 to enforce national unity with US weapons supplied ostensibly to save South Asia from communism. Pakistani soldiers then confined foreign journalists to their hotels before starting Operation Searchlight, a ferocious military action aimed at arresting and killing Awami League leaders. During this military operation, at least 10,000 civilians were massacred within 3 days. There was a large Pakistani force already stationed in East Pakistan, but reinforcements and equipment were flown in from West Pakistan to bolster their strength. The general officer commanding in East Pakistan, Major General Qadim Hussain Raja, summed up the army's attitude when he told an Awami League sympathizer within earshot of fellow officers, "I will muster all I can, tanks, artillery and machine guns, to kill all the traitors and, if necessary, raze Dhaka to the ground. There will be no one to rule. There will be nothing to rule." 4 days after the army operation began, Kissinger reported to Nixon that apparently Yahya has got control of East Pakistan. The conversations between Nixon and Kissinger during this period provide insight into their thoughts on the approaching debacle. Kissinger noted, for example, that all the experts were saying that 30,000 people can't get control of 75 million. He conceded the State Department experts' opinion could still turn out to be true, but resistance in East Pakistan had crumbled for the moment, and the Pakistan government had managed to hide the gravity of the situation from the rest of the world. The use of power against seeming odds pays off, he said. Nixon declared, "When you look over the history of nations, 30,000 well-disciplined people can take 75 million any time. Look what the Spanish did when they came in and took the Incas and all the rest," the US president said. "Look what the British did when they took India." He failed to see the irony of invoking colonial parallels while discussing the use of force to keep a post-colonial state together. Kissinger acknowledged that Mujib was a moderate, but he and Nixon did not trust the Bengalis to be able to rule their own country. They feared an unstable situation, that radical groups would gain strength. As the Pakistan army used force to subdue East Pakistan, Kissinger admitted that the Indians who one normally would expect to favour a breakup of Pakistan aren't so eager for this one. Husain, who had conducted the elections as military governor, agreed with that assessment. He told US officials later that he did not believe in the theory that India engineered Mujib's electoral victory and subsequent stance on autonomy. Prior to March, at least, separation was not Mujib's intention, Husain observed. He also said that India's position has, despite public outcry, been relatively moderate, and its hands before the events in March were relatively clean. But soon after Operation Searchlight, Pakistan blamed India for the events in East Pakistan. Faced with Pakistan's military might, a large number of Awami League activists and East Bengali Hindus crossed the border into the Indian states of Tripura, Assam, and West Bengal. Defecting Bengali soldiers and officers from the Pakistan army soon joined them. These trained military men had preempted a Pakistani order to disarm and detain all ethnic Bengalis in the army. Mujib had been arrested and taken to West Pakistan, but several other Awami League leaders had announced the formation of a Bangladesh government in exile based in the Indian port city of Calcutta. India then asserted that hundreds of thousands of refugees had poured in, creating a refugee emergency. The Indian Intelligence Service, Research and Analysis Wing, RAW, started recruiting and training a guerrilla army from the refugee camps. Soon the Bangladesh Mukti Bahini, Liberation Army, was methodically attacking the Pakistani forces throughout the country's eastern wing. Pakistan rushed in further reinforcements, but this proved difficult because India had banned Pakistani aircraft from flying over its territory after a group of Kashmiris hijacked an Indian civilian airliner to Lahore. Aircraft carrying Pakistani troops had to fly a circuitous route over the sea, avoiding Indian territory, to get to Dhaka. This slowed, but did not stop, as the flights brought in additional soldiers. Pakistani soldiers were trained to fight in the continental climate of West Pakistan's border with India. Most of them had never set foot in East Pakistan and did not speak the Bengali language. In the tropical climate and heavily vegetated terrain of Bengal, they felt lost. Moreover, the Mukti Bahini not only had the support of the people, but its soldiers also knew their territory better. Pakistan alleged that regular Indian forces operated alongside the guerrillas, pretending to be part of the hastily raised Liberation Army. Nixon and Kissinger agreed that the United States could not do much about the situation. "We should just stay out, like in Biafra," Nixon determined, referring to an earlier secessionist war in the African state of Nigeria that ended in the central government's military victory. Kissinger agreed. US involvement would infuriate the West Pakistanis, but it wouldn't gain anything with the East Pakistanis, who wouldn't know about it anyway. As for the Indians, Kissinger pointed out that the Indians are not noted for their gratitude. But the American media did not see the unfolding tragedy with similar nonchalance. The brutality of the Pakistan army shocked US diplomats on the ground in Dhaka. "Here in Dhaka we are mute and horrified witnesses to a reign of terror by the Pakistan military," began a telegram to the State Department, signed by Archer Blood, US Consul General in East Pakistan. Evidence continues to mount that the martial law authorities have a list of Awami League supporters whom they are systematically eliminating by seeking them out in their homes and shooting them down. Blood, a career Foreign Service officer, had titled his cable Selective Genocide. He warned that the full horror of Pakistani military atrocities will come to light sooner or later, and wondered why the US government pretended to believe the Pakistan government's assertions that they were not taking place. The US government had apparently been oblivious to cynical manipulation, Blood said, even when its citizens were evacuated from East Pakistan. The Pakistan government had insisted that the Americans fly first from Dhaka to Karachi on Pakistan International Airlines (PIA) aircraft before leaving the country. The United States could have evacuated its citizens to Bangkok, which was geographically closer, but the Pakistanis denied permission for special military flights because they wanted to earn revenue on the return flights that were ferrying troops to the Eastern Wing. Blood gave vivid details of massacres Pakistani troops had conducted and informed Washington that the army was supporting non-Bengali Muslims in systematically attacking poor people's quarters and murdering Bengalis and Hindus. He further wrote that the United States should be expressing our shock, at least privately, to the government of Pakistan over this wave of terror the Pakistan military directed against its own countrymen. In a second telegram, Blood listed reports of carnage that US citizens present at the time in East Pakistan had provided. He said that there was no armed resistance to the Pakistani military, which was setting Awami League supporters' houses on fire before gunning down people as they escaped from their burning homes. In an effort to eliminate all sources of intellectual ferment, the military was killing Bengali university professors. There were reliable reports of troops engaged in looting homes, beating those who object, including middle-level government officials, and shaking down refugees. There had been incidents of unprovoked firing by military on children and fishermen. A third cable, titled Killings, spoke of the mass murder of students on university campuses. But this recounting of horror stories had little effect on senior US policymakers. Ambassador Farland opined that Yahya was sincere in his efforts to bring about a political solution to disagreements between East and West Pakistan, but acts of insurrection had forced his hand. Farland recognized the Pakistan Army's brutal, ruthless and excessive use of force and shared the indignation and sense of horror Blood and other witnesses at the scene had felt. But in Farland's view, government servants could not base their reaction solely on righteous indignation. Like Nixon and Kissinger, the US ambassador also wanted to stay quiet about the events in East Pakistan. He pointed out, smugly, that the use of force had not affected American property and citizens. For Farland, the matter was Pakistan's internal problem, because the constituted government is using force against citizens accused of flouting its authority. He concluded that, deplorable as current events in East Pakistan may be, it is undesirable that they be raised to the level of a contentious international political issue. At this point, 19 of the 20 Americans posted in the US consulate at Dhaka decided to use the State Department's dissent channel to send what came to be known as the Blood Telegram, named after Archer Blood. It concluded that a Bengali victory was inevitable, as was the establishment of an independent Bangladesh. At the moment, we possess the goodwill of the Awami League, Blood added to the draft of his political officer, W. Scott Butcher. We would be foolish to forfeit this asset by pursuing a rigid policy of one-sided support to the likely loser. The US officials, including the ironically named Blood and Butcher, wrote of their conviction that the US response to the tragedy in East Pakistan served neither our moral interests broadly defined, nor our national interests narrowly defined. They pointed to the US government's failure to denounce the suppression of democracy and its bending over backwards to placate the West Pakistan-dominated government. One of the cable's memorable lines read, "Our government has evidenced what many will consider moral bankruptcy, ironically at a time when the USSR sent President Yahya Khan a message defending democracy." The day after the Blood telegram arrived, 7 specialists on South Asian affairs from the State Department's Near East Asia Bureau, one from the Bureau of Intelligence and Research, and another from the Agency for International Development, sent a letter to Secretary of State Rogers supporting the consulate staff's views. The telegram had significant influence within the US government, even though it did not result in a change in policy. After some effort to convince the Consul General that he and his colleagues were being overly emotional, Rogers recalled Blood to Washington on Nixon's orders. But Blood was not the only one reporting indiscriminate slaughter. Several American journalists were expelled for describing the Pakistan Army's carnage in their dispatches, including Sidney Schanberg of the New York Times. His final story from Dhaka, published in the paper on July the 4th, ran under the headline, "An Alien Army Imposes Its Will. East Pakistan." "Doesn't the world realize that they're nothing but butchers?" Schanberg's story began, quoting a foreigner who has lived in East Pakistan for years, speaking of the Pakistan Army. "That they killed, are still killing Bengalis to intimidate them, to make slaves out of them. That they wiped out whole villages, opening fire at first light and stopping only when they got tired." Schanberg questioned the Army's design of Islamic integrity for Pakistan. He cited a Westerner as saying, "It's a medieval army operation, as if against serfs," adding that the West Pakistanis will use any method just to own East Pakistan. Later accounts from participating Pakistani officers, including Major General Raja, confirmed that thinking within the army. Chester Bowles, the two-time ambassador to India, demanded that the United States discontinue all aid to West Pakistan, except food and medical supplies, and he blamed the United States for arming Pakistan in the first place. "The appalling struggle now going on in East Pakistan," Bowles pronounced, "is a further testament to the folly of doling out arms to friendly governments with little regard for whom they are to be used against or for what reasons." Opposition to violence against the Bengalis soon became an international campaign, joined by politicians, human rights activists, and celebrities. Musicians, including former Beatles George Harrison and Ringo Starr, joined Indian sitar maestro Ravi Shankar in performing at 2 benefit concerts at the Madison Square Garden in New York for the victims of Pakistani atrocities. Other famous musicians, including Bob Dylan, Eric Clapton, and Leon Preston, joined the Bangladesh concert. The concert raised mass awareness as well as $250,000 for Bangladesh, and recordings of the music continued to sell for years to come. In his memoirs written years later, Kissinger confessed that the reports emanating from Dhaka put the administration in a tight spot. "The United States could not condone a brutal military repression," he said, admitting that there was no doubt about the strong-arm tactics of the Pakistani military. He explained the Nixon administration's decision not to react publicly to the military repression in East Pakistan as necessary in order to protect our sole channel to China. Writing in 1979, Kissinger conceded that there was some merit to the charge of moral insensitivity regarding US policy toward Pakistan. In 1971, however, Yaya's role as a messenger to China trumped questioning his decision to unleash brutal violence against Bengalis. 2 weeks after Yahya sent his army into action in East Pakistan, Farland reported that the Pakistan military controlled the province's major cities, while the Bengalis held the countryside. He did not see the West Pakistan establishment as willing to give up voluntarily what it has engaged to protect by the bayonet. But the ambassador recognized that the Pakistan army would face major logistical and operational difficulties during summer, once the monsoons began. He was extremely doubtful that the government of Pakistan could regain its Bengali citizens' loyalty. Farland said that most Bengalis would see through the Indian bogey, which had been invoked to divert attention from West Pakistan's own deeds. Conversely, Saunders thought that the breakup of Pakistan was inevitable, but not necessarily imminent. By Saunders' calculation, US interest was best served by ensuring that it maintained ties with all 3 entities in South Asia, Pakistan, India, and Bangladesh, and denying influence to China and the Soviet Union. The delay in Pakistan's breakup meant that the United States had some time with which to come to terms with the new political reality. Instead of rushing to get on the Bengali bandwagon, the United States should help a friend find a practical and face-saving way out of a bind. In other words, America should advise Yahya, not admonish him. It should also start a general dialogue with India about the longer-term future of South Asia. Based on Saunders' evaluation, Kissinger laid out for the president the United States' options. The first was to support Yahya without questions. This, however, was unlikely to save Pakistan from disintegration and would leave the United States without friends in the region after East Pakistan had formally become Bangladesh. The second was neutrality, which in effect leaned toward East Pakistanis because the rest of the world, including many Western nations, were lining up to support the Bengalis. The third option, which Kissinger preferred, would lead the United States to help Yahya achieve a negotiated settlement. Nixon approved the last option and handed a handwritten note on Kissinger's memo that read, "To all hands, don't squeeze Yahya at this time." He underlined "don't" 3 times. This meant that US encouragement of a political agreement over the future of East Pakistan would not be accompanied by any pressure on Pakistan's military regime. But Nixon and Kissinger did not realize the propensity of Pakistan's generals for self-deception. Yahya was under the impression that his plan of beating East Pakistan into submission was working. Farland reported after a visit to Dhaka that army officials and soldiers give every sign of believing they are now embarked on a jihad against Hindu-corrupted Bengalis. He did not say that the Pakistanis were interpreting the US refusal to pressure Yahya as a sign of support for Pakistan's jihad against its own citizens. In an address to the nation in June, Yahya asked the nation to express gratitude to Almighty Allah for the army's success in East Pakistan. After blaming external forces for the challenges Pakistan faced, Yahya had declared that every one of us is a mujahid, a holy warrior. Although Pakistan had lost to India in previous wars, its military believed it could beat India if it tried to fight on behalf of the Bengalis. To add to its strength, the Pakistan army had recruited thousands of volunteers from Islamist groups in East Pakistan. These Razakars, volunteers, and Mujahideen terrorized critics of the Pakistani central state. To Pakistani leaders, Indian protests over horrors in Bangladesh meant little and could be dismissed as a function of Indian unhappiness with the mere existence of Pakistan. Furthermore, strict censorship kept West Pakistanis from learning about their country's international isolation. Pakistan's economy was in tailspin, but it had recovered before. The lives of West Pakistan's elites had carried on, unperturbed by the violence in the country's distant eastern wing. Now, only the United States had leverage to change Pakistani behavior without a full-fledged war. But Nixon had decided that the United States would not press Yahya in any way. The Nixon administration also gave a wink and a nod to shipping war materiel to Pakistan under export licenses that had not been cancelled despite the announced embargo. Administration officials admitted to Congress later that by October, $2.5 million worth of arms had been released despite the ban. The administration also encouraged the transfer of American-supplied jet fighters from Jordan and Libya to the Pakistani Air Force, in apparent violation of US foreign aid laws. The US General Accounting Office, GAO, also discovered that the Pakistani government diverted $10 million in US humanitarian aid to building military fortifications against India. Some members of Congress and the US media were criticizing Nixon for ignoring West Pakistani cruelties in East Pakistan when Yahya conveyed a message from Zhou Enlai to Nixon. Zhou said that China's government would be willing to publicly welcome Nixon or Nixon's envoy to move forward the US-China dialogue. After much internal deliberation, Nixon decided that Kissinger should travel to China first and that the visit should be secret. Once Kissinger had reached overall agreement with the Chinese, it would then be easier for Nixon to go public with his China initiative. Yahya and Pakistan's foreign ministry made all the arrangements for Kissinger's trip to China. To maintain secrecy, Kissinger arrived in Pakistan and then disappeared from public view after feigning an illness. Farland informed journalists that the National Security Advisor had a severe stomachache and had been taken to Nathia Gali, a mountain resort not far from Islamabad, to recuperate. A Pakistan Airlines plane flew Kissinger to southern China for a clandestine meeting from July 9th to 11th, 1971, with Zhou Enlai. There they arranged for Nixon's week-long trip to China in February 1972, where they restructured long-strained Sino-American relations. Hassan Zahir was the senior-most West Pakistani civil servant in East Pakistan at the time. He later explained the link between Yahya's role as intermediary between China and the United States and the army's overconfidence in relation to the Civil War. Although no one was very clear how the new development was going to help Pakistan extricate itself from the mess, he said, the army's faith in the omnipotence of US support was reinforced. Pakistan's Foreign Office expected to be rewarded for services rendered and started dreaming of a Washington-Islamabad-Beijing axis against the evil designs of its neighbour, India. The secrecy surrounding Kissinger's China trip meant that most people did not know the reason for Nixon's failure to reprimand Yahya over the Pakistan's army's actions in East Pakistan. Indian Prime Minister Indira Gandhi was among those in the dark about this hush-hush diplomacy. In May, she wrote a letter to Nixon describing the gigantic problems which Pakistan's actions in East Bengal have created for India. According to her, Pakistan's war on the people of East Bengal and its impact on us in the form of millions of refugees could not be separated. She claimed that by May 12, 1971, 2,328,507 refugees had been registered, and more were pouring in at the rate of about 50,000 a day. The problem of providing shelter for the refugees would become complicated with the anticipated monsoon rains. Apparently, Pakistan is trying to solve its internal problems by cutting down the size of its population in East Bengal, Gandhi said, adding that Pakistan was trying to change its communal composition through an organized and selective program. She sought the advice of all friendly governments on how they would wish us to deal with the problem. The Indian Prime Minister shared her conviction that the loyalty of a people to a state cannot be enforced at gunpoint, and cautioned that stifling the will of the people in East Bengal will eventually strengthen extremists. Referring to the long-running Marxist insurgency in West Bengal, Gandhi said that the dangers of a link-up between the extremists in the two Bengals are real. She concluded by requesting that the power and prestige of the United States be used to persuade the military rulers of Pakistan to recognize that the solution they have chosen for their problem in East Pakistan is unwise and untenable. But her plea had little effect in Washington. Although Kissinger had voiced fear soon after Ayub's ouster about Chinese communists taking advantage of the situation in East Pakistan, he did not react when Gandhi warned about Marxist gains because of the violence Pakistan's army had unleashed. During the monsoon season, both the influx of refugees into India and the fighting in East Pakistan intensified, as did international condemnation of Pakistan's actions. A World Bank mission told of death and destruction throughout the region, with one member of the mission describing the Bengali town of Kushtia, for example, as looking like a World War II German town having undergone strategic bombing attacks as a result of 12 days of punitive action by the West Pakistani army. 10 members of the 11-nation Aid to Pakistan consortium agreed to withhold aid to Pakistan, but the United States did not. Only ironically did Nixon realize the futility of Pakistan continuing to hang on to East Pakistan by force. During a meeting in the Oval Office, Farland told Nixon that he was convinced that Yahya would fight to the bitter end. "He will commit suicide," Nixon remarked. Nonetheless, he still stuck to his original decision. Farland and Kissinger agreed with the president when he said that the United States had to stand by its friend. All three thought that some deep-rooted hatred between Hindus and Muslims, rather than Yahya's unwillingness to accept the will of the Bengali majority, was fueling the conflict in South Asia. Years later, as he reminisced about his role as National Security Advisor, Kissinger wrote that he had tried to reason with Yahya during his stay in Pakistan for his secret China trip. He said he asked Yahya to put forward a comprehensive proposal to encourage refugees to return home and to deny India a pretext for going to war. He also asked Yahya and his associates to admit the United Nations for relief efforts in East Pakistan and recommended the early appointment of a civilian governor. Yahya promised to consider these suggestions, Kissinger wrote, but fundamentally he was oblivious to his perils and unprepared to face necessities. He and his colleagues did not feel that India was planning war. If so, they were convinced that they would win. When I asked, as tactfully as I could, about the Indian advantage in numbers and equipment, Yahya and his colleagues answered with bravado about the historic superiority of Muslim fighters. If the United States recognized the perils of Yahya's course, however, they did not tell him about the impending disaster. Nixon told British Foreign Secretary Alec Douglas-Home that Yahya had handled the situation in a stupid way, as he also insisted that he's a very decent man, and that the Indians were hypocrites and sanctimonious. Nixon said he knew it was inevitable that Pakistan would come apart, but the Indians were deliberately trying to make it insoluble. He saw the danger that a West Pakistani with a suicidal attitude will decide to have a fight, possibly in Kashmir. Nixon saw his policy as one aimed at averting that war. Kissinger insisted that there had to be a face-saving formula and a transition period. Although a few months earlier he had described Yahya as a splendid product of Sandhurst, he now conceded that he's not very bright. Nixon described Yahya as a decent man, an honourable man. He also expressed to the British minister that he didn't think the British should have granted India and Pakistan independence so soon. They just aren't ready, that's all, he concluded. Indira Gandhi could not ignore Nixon's refusal to lean on Pakistan, as well as his unfriendly view of India. Before his covert trip to China through Pakistan in July, Kissinger had also visited Delhi. During this visit, Indian leaders shared their ideas with the US official about a settlement in East Pakistan. Gandhi told Kissinger that she did not wish to use force and that she was willing to accept any suggestions that the United States may have. Kissinger informed her of the Nixon administration's efforts to establish a relationship with Communist China gradually. He said that these were not directed at India and that they derived from America's global policy. The Indian Prime Minister kept her counsel in relation to China, but she did press Kissinger on East Bengal, as the number of registered refugees who had come into India had risen to 6.8 million. She insisted that Pakistan had to create circumstances that would enable the refugees to return home. The settlement must be between East Pakistan and West Pakistan, she said. This is not an Indo-Pakistani problem. India would not have been involved except for the refugees. Kissinger promised to use what influence we have to encourage a solution. Gandhi tried to persuade Kissinger to recognize the need for more robust US involvement. She said that Pakistan has felt all these years that it will get support from the United States no matter what it does, and this has encouraged an adventurous policy. India is not remotely desirous of territory, and to have the Pakistanis base the whole survival of their country on hostility to India was irritating. If they really had the good of Islam at heart, she said, they would think of the 60 million Muslims in India also. During his stay in Delhi, Kissinger also met India's Defence Minister, Jagjivan Ram, to hear him assess the Chinese military threat to India. Kissinger observed that China might intervene on behalf of Pakistan if there were a war between India and Pakistan. He assured Ram that the United States would take a grave view of any Chinese move against India. But on his return to Washington, Kissinger qualified that assurance in a meeting with the Indian ambassador, Lakshmikant Jha. Kissinger had said that in the case of a Chinese attack that was unprovoked, the United States' interest in India would be very great. In the case of a Chinese attack provoked by an Indian attack on Pakistan, the United States would have a much harder time intervening. But the media reported this conversation in a way that disturbed Indians and cheered Pakistanis. According to the media, Kissinger had conveyed the warning that if war broke out between India and Pakistan and China became involved on Pakistan's side, we would be unable to help you against China. The emergence of a possible coalition between the United States, China, and Pakistan did not portend well for India. The Soviets, however, had problems with both the United States and China, and were not particularly interested in being even-handed between India and Pakistan. Saunders forecast that US support for Pakistan as well as the opening of ties with China would drive India toward the Soviet Union was about to come true. Although India had championed non-alignment since its independence, it was not averse to seeking advantage from either superpower. After all, India had bought weapons from the Soviet Union for years. When the Soviets started selling military hardware to Pakistan, Indira Gandhi aspired to calibrate Soviet arms sales to India and Pakistan. She said she wanted to prevent the Soviet Union from taking over management of the subcontinent. Gandhi wrote to Kosygin in mid-July 1968 to protest Moscow's arms sales to Pakistan. The Soviet premier rushed to assure her that every country in the world could envy Soviet-Indian relations, thus affirming the Soviet preference for India over Pakistan. But Gandhi entertained no illusions about the Soviet Union or any other major power, convinced that all nations were guided only by their own interests and had no obligations to other countries which did not conform to those interests. But she concluded in the summer of 1971 that it was time to accept the Soviet offer, first made by Premier Kosygin in February 1969, to sign a bilateral treaty of friendship. Gandhi had initially stalled on the proposed treaty because she did not want to risk India's ties with the United States. Kosygin had said in Delhi soon after proposing the treaty that if your great country is threatened at its borders, then we will be there to help you. Because Soviet relations with China had been steadily deteriorating, Brezhnev proposed a collective security system in Asia, intended to contain China, that Gandhi turned down. She agreed to a treaty of friendship without an explicit military component, which was akin to the one the Soviets had signed earlier with Egypt. But even after the draft agreement had been negotiated, for almost 2 years Gandhi put off signing the treaty. But on August 9, 1971, Indian Foreign Minister Swaran Singh and his Soviet counterpart, Andrei Gromyko, signed a treaty of peace, friendship and cooperation in New Delhi. Most of the treaty's provisions comprised expressions of goodwill toward one another. India and the Soviet Union agreed to enter into mutual consultations in case of threat to the security of either, and to take appropriate effective measures to ensure peace and the security of their countries. Couched in diplomatic language, the two countries had effectively become security allies. The Indo-Soviet Pact sealed the fate of East Pakistan. Gandhi had completely outmaneuvered Yahya. On the ground, Pakistan's forces were losing territory to the Mukti Bahini, and possibly Indian regulars fighting along their side. Diplomatically, Pakistan was completely isolated. Although China and the United States made sympathetic noises, neither could deny that Pakistani forces had wantonly killed Bengalis in large numbers. Now, with the Soviet Union openly standing with India, there was little chance that the United States or China would risk wider conflict by supporting Pakistan militarily. But Yahya looked at things in a different light. When Nixon and Kissinger assured him of their interest in Pakistan's well-being, he assumed the United States would put its military muscle behind Pakistan. He and his fellow generals also had an unrealistic expectation of China's willingness to save a united Pakistan. Yahya's Sandhurst training had obviously not prepared him for statecraft. Ghulam Ishaq Khan, secretary to the cabinet who later became Pakistan's president, and M.M. Ahmed, economic advisor to the president, told US officials that Yahya was increasingly isolated from events in East Pakistan. There were also reports that the Pakistan Army in East Pakistan operated autonomously, and that Yahya's influence was limited to foreign affairs affecting East Pakistan. But this influence was sufficient for Pakistan to persist with its military plans based on false assumptions. This was the time when Nixon should have had a candid conversation with Yahya. After all, Pakistan's usefulness as a challenge of communication with China had been exaggerated. The United States could have managed its quiet diplomacy with China without allowing the atrocities in East Pakistan. The US president could have told the Pakistani dictator that only direct talks with the Awami League, including Mujib, would work. Further, someone needed to illuminate Yahya about the limits of US support, given Pakistan's other drawbacks. The threat of an aid cut-off, as Bowles had proposed, could have had a sobering effect. Instead, however, Nixon stood by his friend Yahya and leaned on Gandhi, going to the extent of abusing her behind her back. Some commentators suggest that Nixon was convinced that Gandhi hankered for the actual dismemberment of all of Pakistan, notably including West Pakistan. According to this account, the Indian Prime Minister had once said to Nixon that in the British division of India, Pakistan had been most unjustly given both Baluchistan and Pashtunistan. To Nixon, this meant that India questioned the inclusion in Pakistan of Baluchistan and the Pashtun territories, the entire area now forming West Pakistan's frontier with both Afghanistan and Tibet, and therefore, through Tibet, Pakistan's common frontier with China. He believed he had conclusive proof of India's intention to crush the main body of the Pakistan army in West Pakistan. Pakistani officials had also convinced Nixon and Kissinger that the Kennedy administration had given Pakistan a written promise to help protect Pakistan in case of foreign aggression. When Congress and the US media criticized the White House for its support of Pakistan during the Bangladesh crisis, Kissinger advised the new Pakistani ambassador in Washington, Major General N.A.M. Raza, to invoke the Mutual Security Treaty and its clarifications used in subsequent years so as to help justify Nixon's position. Kissinger wanted Pakistan to bring to light Kennedy's promise of aid in case of war, which might have silenced the administration's critics amongst Democrats. Nixon could then have claimed that Pakistan's security had been a bipartisan concern, and said that he was only keeping Kennedy's commitment. As it turned out, Pakistan and the United States had never concluded a mutual security treaty. The references to such a treaty and assurances the Kennedy administration offered to Pakistan were based on Nixon's and Kissinger's ignorance. The Pakistanis were misinterpreting the US-Pakistan Agreement of Cooperation, signed on March 5, 1959, in the context of Pakistan's membership in the Baghdad Pact. The agreement obligated the United States to take appropriate action as may be mutually agreed upon to defend Pakistan against aggression. The agreement, in turn, cited a March 9, 1957 joint resolution of the US Congress that committed the United States to assist nations against aggression by any country controlled by international communism. It also explicitly stated that the use of force had to be consonant with the Constitution of the United States. During India's war with China in 1962, the Kennedy administration had assured Pakistan that if India misused US military assistance in aggression against Pakistan, the United States would take immediately, in accordance with constitutional authority, appropriate action to thwart such aggression. Thus, the United States could not fight a war on Pakistan's behalf without congressional authorization. By encouraging rumors that the United States was bound by treaty to fight along Pakistan, Nixon and Kissinger were hoping to scare India. But Secretary of State Rogers explicitly told Kissinger that the aid memoir of Kennedy's does not commit the US to go to war in the event that Pakistan is attacked by India, and we should not say that. He thought that suggesting the existence of such a commitment amounted to circumventing the US Constitution. We certainly don't want to tell the American people that we are committed to go to war, Rogers pointed out. Kissinger's dilemma was that Yahya flatly refused to negotiate with Mujib or to accept international mediation between East and West Pakistan. Nixon refused to twist Yahya's arm, a man he considered decent but on a suicide mission. Under such circumstances, Kissinger saw psychological pressure on India as the only available option for the United States when trying to prevent all-out war that might result in Pakistan's complete collapse. In their exuberant support of Pakistan, Nixon and Kissinger had chosen to overlook repeated assurances from Gandhi, backed by intelligence, that India would not overrun West Pakistan. The Indian Army began military incursions into Pakistan's eastern wing on November the 21st in support of the Mukti Bahini. On December the 3rd, 1971, Pakistan attacked India from the west in the hope of forestalling the fall of East Pakistan. India recognized Bangladesh as a sovereign country 3 days later and marched into East Pakistan in aid of the Bangladesh government in exile. On December the 14th, as the Indian forces surrounded Dhaka, the Pakistani High Command told the besieged garrison that yellow and white help expected from north and south shortly, a reference to their imaginary Chinese and American military support. At this point, Nixon ordered the deployment of an aircraft carrier, the USS Enterprise, to the Bay of Bengal. The maneuver was aimed at India, but Indira Gandhi was not intimidated. In response, she directed the Indian Navy, if they encountered US vessels, to invite American officers for tea aboard their ships. Further, Nixon's decision disturbed several Western allies. Canada and Britain considered it an unnecessary escalation of a local conflict. Thus, the United States was almost as isolated on the issue as Pakistan. Having failed to find a face-saver for Yahya, Kissinger now sought one for his own president. Then, a letter from Soviet leader Leonid Brezhnev provided Nixon the excuse he needed to back down. Brezhnev offered a guarantee that there would be no attack on West Pakistan once war had ended in the east. Kissinger told Nixon that this meant "we are home." Nixon had wanted to save Pakistan, and he wanted to believe that he had done so. He did not see the irony that in the end, a Soviet assurance, and not American arms supplied over 2 decades, saved only one half of Pakistan. The United States had seen the conflict in East Pakistan as another battle in the global struggle between superpowers. An early American statement condemning Pakistani military repression in the East might have forced Yahya to reconsider his policy. Independent observers believe that the Pakistan army killed between 1 and 200,000 Bengalis in a 9-month period, whereas Bangladesh puts the figure at 3 million. Conversely, Pakistani forces suffered only 1,300 fatalities in combat operations in the Eastern Wing and another 1,400 during war along the West Pakistan border. Pakistani forces in the Eastern Wing surrendered to the Indian military and Mukti Bahini on December 16, 1971. Gandhi then declared once again that India had no territorial ambitions. Now that the Pakistani armed forces have surrendered in Bangladesh and Bangladesh is free, it is pointless, in our view, to continue the present conflict, she announced. But Yahya vowed to continue the war with India. "We shall fight alone if we must," he said in an address to the nation. The headline of Dawn, Pakistan's major English newspaper, on the day of Pakistan's surrender, read, "Victory on all fronts." In the prelude to war, West Pakistanis had been fed false propaganda, and after the war's end, Yahya made it clear that he did not intend to stop the hype. "No sacrifice will be too great to preserve this Islamic homeland of the 120 million people of Pakistan," he said. He then announced plans to introduce a new constitution that would provide greater autonomy to East Pakistan, as though its loss was temporary. Yahya described the army's conduct as reminiscent of the highest tradition of the soldiers of Islam. He also thanked China and the United States for their support for the cause of peace and justice. Following the Pakistan Army's surrender, around 90,000 West Pakistani soldiers and civilians were transported to India as prisoners of war. Indian troops helped the establishment of the new government of Bangladesh and then withdrew completely after 3 months. 4 days after the surrender, on December 20th, 1971, Yahya was removed from power by his own commanders. Bhutto took over as president and chief martial law administrator, the latter a temporary transitional measure. Bhutto then freed Mujib, who returned to Dhaka in triumph to become Prime Minister of Bangladesh. The US tilt had failed to save Pakistan from a split, and it did not help Pakistan or the United States in any other way. Pakistan's army continued to promote hatred of Hindu India and trained its men to avenge the humiliation in Bangladesh. The Pakistani people were never fully told about America's support, and many still complain that the United States failed to save its ally from division and military defeat. As a result, although Pakistan still sought American economic and military assistance, its leaders decided neither to depend on the United States nor to trust it. Chapter 4. Picking up the pieces. 4 months after Pakistan's eastern half severed to become Bangladesh, Zulfikar Ali Bhutto received Sidney Sober at his elegant private home at 70 Clifton in Karachi. As president, Bhutto was still picking up the pieces of a dismembered country. West Pakistanis were slowly accepting the fact that their country had been reduced to half its former size. Parliament had been convened, an interim constitution would soon replace martial law, and work had begun on a permanent constitution. Bhutto was anxious to restructure Pakistan's economy and reconstruct its foreign policy. Sober was a US career diplomat heading the embassy in Islamabad as chargé d'affaires. Farland's tenure as ambassador was drawing to an end, and a new ambassador had not yet been named. In any case, Farland and Bhutto did not like each other. During the 1970 election campaign, Bhutto had accused Farland of working for the CIA and being involved in toppling third world governments. For his part, Farland had limited his embassy's contacts with Bhutto, accusing him of being a US beta. The day he took over as president on December the 20th, 1971, Bhutto had met Farland to make the point, in Sober's presence, that he valued Pakistan's relations with the United States. In that meeting, Bhutto had declared that "we are in one hell of a mess," before saying that Pakistan had a real reason for coming into being, and that this very reason justified its survival. Bhutto wanted the Americans to do everything within their capacity to assist in the monumental effort which lay ahead. Farland had wished him well, expressed hopes of seeing him frequently, and then designated Sober as the secondary link between Bhutto and the embassy. Since Bhutto's rise to the presidency, Sober had effectively been Bhutto's principal point of contact with the US government. The two met often. During the meeting at Bhutto's Karachi home on April 3, 1972, Sober wanted to review Bhutto's persistent proposal for closer defense ties. Pakistan's defense secretary had offered the Americans a naval base along the Arabian Sea coast, and Pakistani officers had dropped casual hints to diplomats that it was now prepared for a US military presence. Sober informed Washington that his firm policy had been to listen politely on such occasions and to be entirely non-committal. Pakistan's ambassador in Washington, General N.A.M. Raza, had written a letter to the State Department providing a list of equipment Pakistan urgently needed for its armed forces. He sought agreement in principle for release of lethal sophisticated equipment such as artillery and anti-aircraft weapons, aircraft, ground-to-ground and ground-to-air missiles, missile-carrying boats, submarines, etc., at reduced price and on deferred payment. Attachments to Raza's letter included new requests for 100 M47-48 tanks, 4 submarines, 12 B-57 bombers, 25 F-5 aircraft, 1,000 M601 trucks, and some artillery and communications equipment. Pakistan also wanted the 300 armoured personnel carriers that the United States had earlier agreed to sell. It also wanted the United States to replace equipment, including 74 tanks, 25 F-86s, 4 B-57s, and 3 F-104s that had been lost in the December 1971 war with India. As he sat down with Bhutto at his Karachi home, Sober expressed concern that Pakistan had once again started asking for a substantial quantity of US arms on soft terms. This did not fit with Bhutto's emphasis on the need for normalization of relations with India. Sober referred to a visit to Washington by Pakistan's Secretary-General for Foreign Affairs, Aziz Ahmed. He noted that Ahmed had made a rather hard-line presentation on Soviet intentions in the subcontinent, and, based on that, had expressed an urgent need for American weapons. He also cited Raza's laundry list for military equipment. Sober knew that Pakistan was not seeking weapons to defend against an impending Soviet attack. He also felt that immediate rearmament should not be the first priority for a country that had so recently suffered military humiliation. After all, Pakistan's economy was hardly back on its feet. Tens of thousands of its soldiers and civilians were prisoners of war, and it had yet to recognize Bangladesh and settle issues that the Eastern Wing's secession had created. Why then, Sober asked, was Pakistan requesting that the United States resume supplying military aid? Bhutto replied that his senior military leaders were pointing to some obvious gaps in defense structure and wanted him to acquire some sophisticated weapons for them. He was not in a position to ignore the military, which remained powerful even after its defeat. He had forwarded the request for defense equipment to the United States because it was the only logical source for some types of equipment. Bhutto also voiced the hope that the United States would loosen up soon in supply of spare parts, so as to keep operational the equipment that had been previously provided. Discussing relations with India, Bhutto insisted that his aim remained an honourable political settlement. He wanted to see Pakistan's military budget reduced, but whether such a cut would be possible would depend on India. In a subsequent meeting with Sober, Bhutto opened up further, saying that he still had problems to contend with in his relations with the Pakistani military. During a visit to an army officers' mess, Bhutto had found officers telling him that India had not really defeated Pakistan, and that Pakistanis could give a very good account of themselves if they really had to fight. Pakistan's army was apparently preparing its officers and men for another war, rather than learning a lesson from repeated defeat. The army blamed foreign powers and Pakistani politicians for their poor performance, and argued that they would do better if they had better equipment. Like American diplomats who served in Pakistan right after partition of India in 1947, Sober sympathized with Pakistan's leaders. Bhutto and his colleagues were trying to forge what Bhutto termed a new Pakistan, just as Pakistan's founding generation had struggled to build their new country carved out of India. There was passion and enthusiasm in Islamabad, as there had been in Karachi 23 years earlier. But Sober could not understand why Pakistan was focusing on rebuilding its military before anything else. After all, the country was short of resources. Poverty, disease, and illiteracy were rampant, and the loss of East Pakistan meant that it had fewer borders to protect. Still, Pakistan sought fighter jets and tanks. Sober's astonishment in this regard was similar to that of Americans who had seen Pakistanis requesting military assistance in the country's early years, ignoring other pressing problems. History was now repeating itself. The news that Pakistani forces in the Eastern Wing had surrendered had stunned Pakistanis, because the West Pakistani media had been projecting imaginary victories of the Pakistan army. The religious parties had plastered the walls in major cities with posters and stickers bearing the slogan, "Crush India." And only 4 days before the surrender, Radio Pakistan had announced that the question of any surrender is ruled out because our troops are determined to lay down their lives. Although the military high command knew better, it did not prepare the people of West Pakistan for defeat until the very end. Only at that time did the government release sketchy reports of a grim military situation and fighting against all odds. On the afternoon of December the 16th, around the time the formal surrender ceremony was being held at the racecourse grounds in Dhaka, the Pakistan government put out a 27-word statement that read, "Latest reports indicate that following an arrangement between the local commanders of India and Pakistan, fighting has ceased in East Pakistan and the Indian troops have entered Dhaka." For West Pakistanis, fed on rhetoric of imminent victory in jihad, this was a colossal anticlimax. The war had been lost, and there was no way of turning the tables. Amid nationwide depression, reported the New York Times, people went to mosques to pray and weep. Newspaper editorials demanded why Yahya had not told the people that defeat was so near, and why he had not ordered the army to fight the Indians to death. Farland informed the State Department that he foresaw the eventual retirement of Yahya and the rise to real power of Bhutto in the aftermath of defeat. He also noted that the US government enjoyed exceptional access to Pakistan's government during the difficult situation, and that such access to Pakistani leaders, including Bhutto, should continue for the foreseeable future. But he warned that the United States should not confuse access with leverage with regard to what West Pakistan sees as its national interests. As things turned out, Pakistan's elite continued to see India as an existential threat, and therefore defined national interest through that prism. In an uncharacteristically realistic analysis, the US ambassador observed that the Soviets would have a very limited role in West Pakistan, whereas the Chinese would retain the position of a major ally for West Pakistanis. He foresaw a period of bitter recriminations within the establishment and among the general public in West Pakistan. Farlan said that the army was exhausted but intact as an institution, even though public confidence in the army had been shaken. The Pakistan army, he said, may lean on Bhutto to shoulder major responsibility for rebuilding national morale. As the American ambassador forecast developments within the power corridors correctly, US journalists described the national mood in their dispatches. The Pakistanis believe that India will never rest until Pakistan ceases to exist, wrote New York Times reporter Malcolm Brown. Lopsided military budgets seem certain to dominate the economy of Pakistan, he predicted. The problem, he wrote, lay in the illusion of military parity with India. The latest war had shattered the illusion that had been painfully maintained through two earlier wars since independence in 1947. But Pakistanis preferred to live in denial, so they would soon try to recreate the illusion. Brown pointed to the Pakistani supposition that in the final hour of need, China and the US would come to the rescue during the East Pakistan debacle. He had seen signs in the garrison town of Rawalpindi that read, "We love you, Mao and Nixon." Apparently, a map had been published showing Chinese troops charging down into India. Brown noticed a thrill of expectation after reports that the US carrier Enterprise was headed for the Bay of Bengal. There were even a few who believed up to the end that Russia would pull in her claws and return to the mediating role she assumed in ending the Indo-Pakistani War of 1965, he observed. But there was little, if any, soul-searching among Pakistanis. Instead, the surrender in Dhaka was compared to the fall of Muslim Baghdad in 1258 to the Mongols. Like the 13th century defeat, this one was also attributed to the elite's lack of piety, inadequate military preparedness, various conspiracy, and the enemy's cunning. Some Pakistanis even sought to metaphorically relocate Pakistan. Many Pakistanis are speaking of growing closer to Central Asia and away from the Indian subcontinent, reported Brown. New and stronger ties with Turkey, Iran, and Afghanistan seem likely. Instead of pausing to reflect on what had gone wrong, Pakistanis sought someone to blame, and over time, different factions settled on their choice among Yahya, Mujib, and Bhutto as the domestic villains. There was unanimity, however, regarding the external cause of the disaster. India had caused Pakistan's breakup, and the rest of the world, including the United States, had not done enough to stop Indian aggression. Bhutto was in New York, representing Pakistan at the United Nations, when Pakistan's army surrendered in Dhaka. He knew he would now lead Pakistan, as Yahya's position had become untenable. There were spontaneous demonstrations in several Pakistani cities against the military dictator. Junior officers had heckled a senior general close to Yahya when he tried to give a speech at army headquarters. Some senior generals were even coercing Yahya to hand over power to Bhutto. As soon as Bhutto got word of this development, he sought a meeting with President Nixon and Secretary of State Rogers. The Americans then hastened to arrange the meetings at short notice. Although Rogers had not dealt with Bhutto before, he knew that most US officials had reservations about him. Rogers had mentioned to Nixon in the Oval Office a few days earlier that Yahya might turn over Pakistan's affairs to Bhutto. Nixon had exclaimed, "The son of a bitch is a total demagogue." Nixon said that during his 1967 private trip to Pakistan, Ayub had given him a rundown on Bhutto. "He's a pretty good judge of men," Nixon said, referring to Ayub, going on to say that Bhutto, was just bad news. The US president also noted that Bhutto was leftish. But Nixon did not quite know the real source of Bhutto's left-wing orientation. Is he anti-India? Anti-US? The president had asked. Kissinger had explained that the Pakistani leader was violently anti-Indian and pro-Chinese. But there was a silver lining for the United States in the prospect of Bhutto's rise to the helm in Pakistan. In a way, we gain a lot if he comes in, Kissinger remarked, pointing out that Nixon had less obligations to Bhutto than he did to Yahya. It is implausible that Bhutto knew of that specific exchange between Nixon, Kissinger, and Rogers. He had enough friends among Americans to know what US leaders thought of him. As such, he decided to clarify things at the outset during his meeting with Rogers. Bhutto said that he knew he was sometimes referred to as the Yankee-baiting former foreign minister, but he was nonetheless determined to open a new chapter in the history of Pakistan-US relations. Bhutto's choice of words in expressing appreciation for US support for Pakistan in the ongoing crisis was interesting. He said that the US government had stood by the basic principles of international law and civilized society, as these had emerged after World War II. Pakistanis, he went on, valued American actions and statements, which, he said, were important in demonstrating that World War II had not been fought in vain. Bhutto knew that the State Department had been less keen on Nixon's policy of tilting toward Pakistan, so he wanted to make the point that the United States had done the right thing. The two main points Bhutto made to Rogers related to the Soviet Union and India. He said that the whole picture of international law had been disrupted by Soviet behavior in the South Asian crisis. According to him, there were unconfirmed reports that the Soviets had gone even to the point of providing Soviet personnel on Indian warships, and had equipped Indian vessels and aircraft with latest missiles and technology. This was clearly meant to establish Bhutto's credentials as being anti-Soviet. On India, Bhutto said he was prepared for reconciliation with Pakistan's traditional enemy. The Pakistani leader wanted India to act with magnanimity, or risk becoming an enemy of Pakistan for all time. He drew the analogy with the enmity between Carthage and Rome in ancient times, which lasted for almost a century. If India missed the present opportunity, Bhutto said, there would be hatred for all time, utter chaos, and terrible massacre. He wanted the Indians to understand that he would need a month or more to prepare public opinion for what has taken place. Although Pakistan had lost another war, Bhutto insisted that India must act in humility. He added that in his view, the Indians lacked vision and he could not be confident of the Indian response. Rogers observed that despite Indians' capacity to appear magnanimous publicly, they could be very sanctimonious and self-righteous. Bhutto concurred, making the point that for that very reason a US role was necessary. The US should make clear to India that it had treaty relationship with Pakistan and that it was not going to fold up its carpets and leave, he said. Bhutto also reminded Rogers of the ongoing dispute over Kashmir. Describing Mujib as a good speaker, but very blank in the head, he anticipated that the Bengali leader would not remain a central figure in Bangladesh beyond 3 months. Thus, he wanted an opportunity to explore the possibility of a loose confederation between East and West Pakistan. The meeting between Bhutto and Nixon before Bhutto's return to Pakistan was rather short because of Nixon's other pre-scheduled engagements. But Bhutto did tell Nixon that Pakistan was completely in the debt of the United States for its support during the recent trying days. He repeated what he had said to Rogers about being called a Yankee hater in the past and promised closer ties with the United States. Bhutto spoke of Nixon's personal leadership and support, joked about being willing to manage his 1972 presidential campaign, and repeated the views he had shared with Rogers regarding India and the Soviet Union. For his turn, Nixon used the opportunity to let Bhutto know that he cared about Pakistan and would work with its new leader as he had with previous ones. For Bhutto, it was important to build bridges with the White House and the State Department before he assumed power in Islamabad. Pakistan would need US assistance again, especially if it were to continue confronting India. When Nixon asked Bhutto what he thought the future held for Pakistan, the Pakistan president-in-waiting said he would take 30 days to assess the will of the people before establishing a series of domestic reforms. But he had already laid out his country's future foreign policy. Like before, one of its pillars would be to seek money and arms from the United States to maintain military parity with India.